It is February 1945. A Marine is crawling toward a concrete bunker on a black volcanic beach. Naval guns have been hitting this island for 3 days. Aircraft have dropped everything they have. The bunker is still there. The men inside are still fighting. Bullets don't reach them. Grenades don't finish them. The position should be impossible to take. Then a Marine stands up with a metal tank strapped to his back and walks toward the opening. He is the most exposed man on the battlefield. Every enemy gun that can reach him is trying to. He pulls the trigger. A stream of burning fuel enters the bunker opening. The position goes silent in seconds. My name is Eddie Arsenal. Hit that subscribe button right now if this is your first time here. This channel is where the real stories get told. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. The Japanese had built fortifications so strong that the most powerful naval bombardment in the history of warfare could not destroy them. And the weapon that finally broke those fortifications was not a new bomber, not a bigger artillery piece, not a more powerful naval gun. It was a tank of fuel and a nozzle, developed from technology that military planners had called a barbaric relic of World War I. Today we are talking about the M2 Flamethrower, a weapon almost nobody wanted to adopt, and that became the single most decisive close-quarters weapon of the entire Pacific War. But this story is bigger than one weapon. It is a story about what happens when a form of warfare evolves faster than the weapons designed to defeat it, and the brutal solution that finally catches up. It is also a story about the men who carried it. Because the Marine flamethrower operator had the highest casualty rate of any specialist in the Pacific Theater, and the highest mission success rate of any specialist in the Pacific Theater. Both of those facts are true at the same time. Sit with that for a moment. To understand why the M2 Flamethrower mattered, you have to understand what it was built to defeat. And what it was built to defeat was unlike anything American military planners had faced before. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent years perfecting underground fortress warfare. Not trenches, not simple bunkers, complete underground cities, tunnel networks connecting fighting positions, supply caches, medical stations, and command posts. On islands like Iwo Jima and Peleliu, Japanese engineers carved these systems directly into volcanic rock and coral. Some tunnel networks ran for miles beneath the surface. Some chambers were large enough to hold hundreds of men. From above, from the air, from naval guns, from artillery, these positions were essentially invisible. A position that held 50 men and 3 machine guns might have an entrance no wider than a doorway. The naval bombardment that preceded the Marine landing at Iwo Jima was one of the most intense in the history of warfare. American ships fired approximately 22,000 shells in the 3 days before the landing. Intelligence estimated that nothing on the island could have survived it. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they discovered the intelligence was wrong. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 men was almost entirely intact, underground, waiting, positioned in interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the beach. The first wave of Marines took catastrophic casualties in the first hours, not because the Japanese were in better positions above ground, but because they were in better positions below it, and conventional weapons could not reach them there. This was not a new problem by Iwo Jima. American forces had been encountering Japanese fortified underground positions since Tarawa in 1943, through the brutal fighting on New Georgia, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. Each campaign had taught the same lesson. Conventional weapons could suppress these positions but could not destroy them. Bullets fired into a bunker opening had to travel the exact path of the opening to reach anyone inside. Grenades thrown through openings could be thrown back, blocked by internal baffles, or fail to penetrate deep enough to affect men sheltered in connecting tunnels. The Japanese had specifically engineered their positions to defeat these weapons. Bunker openings were angled so that fire from outside could not enter directly. Tunnel systems had multiple chambers, so that a weapon penetrating the first chamber would not reach the second. Now let's talk about the weapon itself, because the M2 Flamethrower's design was a direct response to these specific engineering problems, and understanding how it worked explains why it succeeded where every other weapon had failed. The M2 Flamethrower consisted of 2 main components: a backpack assembly carried by the operator, and a projector unit that aimed and fired the weapon. The backpack contained 2 cylinders of fuel and 1 smaller cylinder of compressed nitrogen that provided the propellant pressure to project the fuel. The fuel itself was a critical part of the weapon's effectiveness. Early flamethrowers used straight gasoline, which burned effectively but flowed and scattered on impact. The M2 used napalm-thickened fuel, a gel-like mixture that behaved completely differently when it hit a surface. Napalm-thickened fuel changed everything. Instead of scattering on impact, the thickened fuel clung to surfaces, walls, equipment, everything. It could be projected through a narrow opening and would adhere to interior surfaces rather than splashing harmlessly. It burned longer, hotter, and in a more concentrated area. The M2 had a range of approximately 20 to 40 meters and could sustain approximately 7 seconds of continuous fire before the fuel cylinders were exhausted. 7 seconds sounds brief, but 7 seconds of continuous napalm fire projected into an enclosed bunker was enough to kill everyone inside and make the position untenable for any survivors. The complete assembly weighed approximately 68 pounds when fully loaded. The operator was also one of the most recognizable targets on the battlefield. The twin cylinders on his back were visible from considerable distance, and every Japanese soldier understood exactly what they meant. The weapon had genuine limitations. The fuel cylinders were vulnerable to puncture. Operators had to approach within 40 meters of a position that had already been killing Marines at longer ranges. And the 7-second fuel capacity meant that a failed first burst required withdrawal, resupply, and a second approach under the same fire. These limitations made the tactics around the flamethrower as important as the weapon itself. Marine doctrine evolved through combat experience into a specific assault sequence that addressed each limitation systematically, and the effectiveness of that doctrine was as decisive as the weapon's chemistry. The standard flamethrower assault developed into a team concept. The operator was never sent forward alone. A team of 4 to 6 Marines provided the suppressive fire and physical protection that gave the operator the seconds he needed to close with the target and employ the weapon. The team's riflemen would suppress the bunker opening, not trying to kill the men inside, which was unlikely given the position's construction, but preventing them from accurately engaging the approaching operator. While the rifles fired, the operator moved forward, closed to effective range, and fired. Timing was everything. The suppressive fire had to be sustained exactly long enough for the operator to close the distance and fire, but the riflemen could not keep their heads down indefinitely. The approach had to be fast. The weapon had to be accurate on the first burst. There was very little margin for error in any direction. Now let's talk about Polelo, because Polelo is where the M2 Flamethrower's role in Pacific warfare became undeniable, and where the cost of that role was paid in the most brutal possible terms. Polelo was supposed to take 4 days. It took over 2 months. The island of Peleliu in the Palau chain was a Japanese fortress by the time the 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944. Japanese Colonel Nakagawa had abandoned beach defense doctrine entirely and organized his garrison of approximately 10,000 men around the island's cave and tunnel network. Nakagawa's plan was deliberate and sophisticated. Allow the Marines to land, let them come inland, and then fight them from underground positions that could not be destroyed from the air or sea. Every cave was fortified. Every tunnel had multiple exits. Destroying one position simply exposed the approach to the next. The Marines expected 4 days of hard fighting. What they encountered instead was a garrison that had made itself immune to conventional assault. Casualties in the first days were catastrophic. The 1st Marine Division took over 1,000 casualties on the first day alone. The terrain of Peleliu made everything worse. The Umarbrogol Mountain, which Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge, was a jagged coral formation riddled with caves. Every approach to a cave was covered by fire from another cave. There was no safe angle of approach to anything. Conventional weapons were tried systematically and failed systematically. Artillery fired directly at cave openings failed. Demolition charges placed at entrances failed. Naval gunfire was called in at ranges bordering on dangerous to the attacking Marines, and the caves survived it. The M2 Flamethrower became the answer that every other weapon had failed to provide. A flamethrower team could approach a cave entrance under suppressive fire and achieve in 7 seconds what artillery had failed to achieve in hours. The fire followed the shape of the cave. It reached the men that no other weapon could reach. The operators who carried the M2 on Peleliu paid for every success personally. Casualty rates among flamethrower operators were among the highest of any specialist in the Pacific War, because every approach to a cave entrance was a movement through fire, and the man with the twin cylinders was the priority target for every Japanese weapon that could see him. And yet the mission success rate for flamethrower assaults on Peleliu was dramatically higher than for any other assault method used against the cave positions. A position that resisted artillery and rifle assault for days would frequently be neutralized in a single flamethrower assault. The correlation was undeniable to every Marine officer watching it happen. This created a specific and terrible dynamic that Marine commanders had to manage. The most effective weapon available was also the weapon whose operators were most likely to be killed using it. Sending flamethrower operators forward repeatedly against successive positions meant consuming the most effective specialist capability faster than it could be replaced. Now let's talk about Iwo Jima, because Iwo Jima is where the M2 Flamethrower's role reached its defining moment. By February 1945, Marine doctrine for fighting Japanese underground positions had been refined through 2 years of brutal experience. The flamethrower team assault was now standard doctrine. The M4A1 Sherman tank had also been modified for Iwo Jima, fitted with a flamethrower projector in place of its main gun, creating what Marines called the Zippo tank. The Zippo solved the operator exposure problem that had cost so many lives at Peleliu. The projector was inside armored protection, and the vehicle could approach cave entrances that no man on foot could reach alive. The Zippo tanks at Iwo Jima represented a direct evolution from the lessons of Peleliu, the combination of the flamethrower's unique effectiveness with the armor protection a tank provided. It was combined arms applied to the specific problem of cave warfare, and it was significantly more effective than either the tank or the flamethrower operating separately. But the M4A1 Zippo could not go everywhere on Iwo Jima. The volcanic terrain, black sand that shifted under vehicle weight, steep ridgelines, narrow approaches to cave entrances, meant that many positions could only be reached by a man on foot. The M2 backpack flamethrower remained essential wherever the Zippo tanks could not follow. The fighting on Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. American forces systematically reduced approximately 1,500 Japanese defensive positions using flamethrower assault, demolitions, and direct fire from tanks and artillery. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, approximately 18,000 died in the fighting. The underground fortress that had been designed to be impenetrable had been penetrated, position by position, cave by cave, bunker by bunker, by men carrying 68-pound tanks of burning fuel and walking toward the most dangerous places on Earth. Now I want to pause here because this story requires it. The men who carried the M2 flamethrower were asked to do something that no amount of training can fully prepare a human being to do. They were asked to walk toward a position that was actively trying to kill them, knowing they were the priority target, knowing their equipment could kill them if it failed. The psychological weight of operating a flamethrower in combat is not something that appears in technical manuals. It is something that the men who did it carried for the rest of their lives. The sound of a position going silent, the smell of burning fuel and volcanic air, the specific knowledge of what the weapon did to the men inside the positions it silenced. Those men were not monsters. They were Marines who had been given a specific mission, neutralize positions that no other weapon could neutralize, and who performed that mission at extreme personal risk, because the alternative was watching more of their fellow Marines die, trying to take positions with weapons that were not equal to the task. That context does not make the weapon comfortable to discuss. It should not, but it makes the men who carried it comprehensible, and it makes their courage specific in a way that deserves to be named directly. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what it cost. They did it anyway, for the men beside them. Now let's talk about why the M2 worked when everything else failed, because the chemistry and physics of what fire does in an enclosed space explains the weapon's effectiveness more clearly than any tactical analysis. A bullet fired into a bunker travels in a straight line. It can be dodged if the occupants are not in its direct path. It can be blocked by internal walls. In a tunnel system with multiple chambers and angles, a bullet that enters the first chamber may not reach anyone in the second. A grenade produces blast and fragmentation in all directions, but blast attenuates rapidly with distance. A grenade in a tunnel kills effectively in the immediate vicinity of detonation, but a tunnel with multiple chambers absorbs and redirects the blast, protecting men sheltered beyond the first turn. Fire behaves differently from both. Burning napalm projected into an enclosed space does not travel in a straight line. It fills the space available to it. It cannot be dodged by moving behind a wall. It flows around corners and fills chambers. It burns continuously as long as fuel and oxygen are available. The oxygen consumption aspect is one of the least discussed but most decisive elements of the flamethrower's effectiveness. A position filled with burning napalm becomes lethal, not only through direct flame contact, but through oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide production. Men sheltered in inner chambers protected from the direct flame were not protected from the atmosphere that followed it. The Japanese had engineered their positions specifically to defeat bullets and blast. They could not engineer them to defeat fire in the same way. The very features that made the positions resistant to conventional weapons, enclosed spaces, multiple chambers, limited ventilation, made them more vulnerable to fire, not less. This is the central paradox of Japanese fortress warfare in the Pacific. The engineering that made their positions impervious to naval gunfire and artillery made them ultimately vulnerable to the one weapon that conventional military thinking had dismissed as a barbaric relic. The stronger the position, the more completely fire dominated it. Now let's talk about the broader impact. Because the M2's tactical effectiveness at the individual position level translated into strategic consequences that shaped how the war ended. The ability to neutralize Japanese underground positions compressed the timeline of Pacific Island campaigns significantly. Islands that might have resisted for months were reduced in weeks. The momentum of the American advance across the Pacific was sustained in part because the flamethrower gave Marine assault units the tool to keep moving. Japanese defensive doctrine evolved in response to the flamethrower threat, but the evolution was limited by physics. Making entrances smaller reduced the flamethrower's ability to project fuel, but also reduced the position's ability to project fire outward at attacking Marines. Every adaptation that improved resistance to the flamethrower reduced the position's offensive capability. American planners noted this trade-off and factored it into assault planning. A position with a very small entrance might be more resistant to flamethrower assault, but it was also less dangerous to approaching Marines. The flamethrower had forced the Japanese into a defensive dilemma that had no good solution. The M2 Flamethrower was also used in the European theater against German bunkers in the hedgerow country of Normandy, against fortified positions in the Siegfried Line, and in urban fighting through German cities in 1945. Its effectiveness against enclosed defensive positions was not unique to the Pacific. It was a property of fire itself. In Europe, the flamethrower was particularly effective against the concrete fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Positions designed to resist artillery and direct fire were vulnerable to flamethrowers for exactly the same reason that Japanese cave positions were. The enclosed construction that provided protection from conventional weapons became a liability when fire was introduced. Now let's talk about production. Because the M2 Flamethrower's battlefield effectiveness depended on a logistics chain that had to deliver not just the weapons, but the fuel, the replacement parts, and the trained operators to the forward units that needed them. Approximately 25,000 M2 flamethrowers were manufactured during the war. This production volume meant that availability was not a limiting factor in Pacific operations. Units that needed them could be equipped, and losses could be replaced without the weapon becoming a scarce resource. The fuel supply was a more complex logistics challenge. Napalm-thickened fuel was produced in bulk and shipped forward through the same supply chain that provided food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Each refill for the M2 weighed approximately 50 pounds, meaning forward supply planning had to specifically account for flamethrower operations. Operator training was the most critical supply challenge of all. The M2 required operators who understood not just the weapon's mechanics, but the specific tactical judgment to employ it safely and effectively. And the combat replacement rate for operators meant that training pipelines had to run continuously throughout the war. Now let's bring this story to its conclusion, because the complete arc of the M2 Flamethrower reveals something important about how wars are actually won. Not always by the weapon that looks most impressive, sometimes by the weapon that solves the problem everything else could not. The Japanese had built fortifications that absorbed 3 days of the most intense naval bombardment in history without meaningful damage. They had engineered a form of warfare that made conventional American weapons tactically irrelevant at the position level. On paper, those positions should never have fallen. And then a Marine stood up with 68 pounds on his back, walked toward the most dangerous place on the battlefield, and pulled a trigger. The position that had survived everything else did not survive 7 seconds of fire. That is not a small thing. That is the entire story of how the Pacific War's most terrifying defensive system was finally broken. Not by more firepower from a distance, but by one man closing the distance and applying the one weapon that the position's own engineering could not defeat. The M2 Flamethrower, called a barbaric relic, almost not adopted, carried by the men with the highest casualty rate in the Pacific theater. The weapon that finally broke fortifications that nothing else could touch. Now let's give it the final assessment it deserves. Tactically, it was the only weapon available that could reliably neutralize Japanese underground defensive positions. Every other weapon failed in documented, predictable ways. The M2 succeeded because fire behaves differently from bullets and blast in enclosed spaces, and the Japanese had built positions specifically optimized to fail against bullets and blast. Strategically, it compressed the timeline of Pacific Island campaigns and sustained the momentum of the American advance. The human cost of those campaigns, already devastating, would have been significantly higher without the flamethrower's ability to neutralize positions that could not otherwise be taken. For the men who carried it, it was the heaviest possible assignment the Pacific War produced, the highest casualty rate, the most direct personal exposure to the weapon's effects. Those men carried the M2 on their backs and its consequences in their minds for the rest of their lives. The M2 Flamethrower is not a comfortable weapon to discuss. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to solve a specific problem that was killing American Marines faster than anything else in the Pacific War. It solved that problem. The cost was real. The necessity was equally real. The Japanese built their fortifications to be the last word in defensive warfare. Impenetrable, permanent, designed to outlast every weapon America could bring. They were right about every weapon, except one. Drop a comment telling me, did you know the flamethrower operator had both the highest casualty rate and the highest mission success rate of any Pacific specialist? And if you want to know about the American artillery innovation that made German defensive positions across Europe obsolete overnight, a technology so simple that engineers almost didn't bother patenting it, that story is next. Subscribe to Eddie Arsenal, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one. Let's load it up.